Imagine spending years becoming the person you were always meant to be, only to learn the world still sees you as who you were at your worst moment. That's the reality Christopher Young woke up to, a man who rebuilt himself piece by piece, only to discover that redemption doesn't always matter when the system has already written your ending. His story isn't just about a crime or a sentence. It's about how far someone can change, how deeply someone can grow, and how little that growth means when the clock is already ticking. And as the countdown to his final day began, one truth became impossible to ignore. The fight for his life didn't start in a courtroom. It started long before anyone ever knew his name. Hours before sunrise, Christopher Young lay on a narrow prison bunk, staring into the kind of darkness that feels alive. The date was already decided, the time already scheduled. In less than a day, the state of Texas planned to end his life, and nothing he'd done over the last decade, no growth, no change, no redemption, could slow the countdown that echoed in every corner of that cell. He wasn't the reckless 21-year-old who once spiraled through the streets, numb on alcohol and chaos. He wasn't the gang member who lived off adrenaline or the kid who thought anger was strength. The man on that bunk had spent years undoing the damage inside himself, teaching younger inmates how to survive without violence, and learning a peace he never knew existed. But death row doesn't reward transformation. It only measures time, and as the minutes slipped by, Christopher replayed everything. The pain he caused, the people he loved, the life he might have lived if change hadn't come so late. Just hours earlier, he'd faced the parole board, not begging for mercy, but challenging the idea that justice had been equal in his case. He reminded them that others with similar crimes had been spared, especially men whose skin color bought them more leniency than he ever received. Yet the moment he finished speaking, their expressions said it all. They were never going to move. Now, in the stillness of his cell, he faced a truth colder than the concrete beneath him. He had rebuilt himself into a better man, but the system only remembered the broken one. And the road that brought him here didn't start with the decision he made at 21. It began years earlier, long before that store, long before the gun, in a life already bending toward disaster. On a quiet Sunday morning in San Antonio, a decision made in seconds shattered two families forever. Christopher Young walked into a small convenience store with no plan, no script, and no sense of control over himself. He wasn't thinking about money, and he wasn't thinking about consequences. His mind was fogged with alcohol, drugs, and the kind of emotional chaos that had been building for years. Behind the counter stood Hasmukh Patel, a man known for kindness, routine, and the belief that patience could calm almost anything. He tried to speak softly, hoping to ease the tension in the air. But Christopher wasn't hearing words, he was drowning in his own storm. Then a single moment ruptured everything. A trigger pulled too fast. A life taken before anyone understood what was actually happening. Christopher didn't grab cash, didn't search the store. He ran, confused, shaking, and horrified by what had just happened. Police found him not long after, sitting on a curb, crying and mumbling that he didn't remember how things spiraled. The footage was clear, the confession was immediate, and the community's grief sharpened into anger within hours. To prosecutors, this was simple. A violent young gang member had taken an innocent man's life. But what the courtroom never stopped to consider was the weight behind that moment. The trauma he carried, the addictions he couldn't outrun, and the spiral that had been building since childhood. None of that mattered, not then. The state saw one thing: a murder with no excuse. And for Christopher Young, that instant inside a quiet corner store became the point where his life stopped moving forward, and started counting down. Long before Christopher Young ever touched a gun, his life was already bending toward a breaking point. He grew up in a home where pressure never let up, where survival felt more familiar than safety, and where the people he depended on were fighting their own battles. But everything changed the day he lost his father. Christopher was only 8 when the man he looked up to was shot and taken from him. That moment didn't just hurt his family, it fractured the foundation he was supposed to grow on. With that loss came a silence no one in the house knew how to fill. There was no therapy, no guidance, no adults helping him make sense of grief that heavy. Instead, the streets stepped in first. The neighborhood didn't leave space for mourning. It pushed him forward, demanding toughness he didn't feel and forcing him to adapt long before he understood what he was adapting to. And yet, buried under all that turmoil was a spark. Teachers remembered a kid who solved puzzles in minutes, who played chess like he was 3 moves ahead, who picked up instruments and made them sing on the first try. He had the mind of someone built for greatness, if greatness had room to grow where he lived. But talent means little when danger is louder. By the time he turned 12, the Bloods offered something he thought he needed: identity, protection, and a place where people didn't care about his pain as long as he followed the rules. It wasn't glamour that pulled him in. It was the promise of belonging in a world that kept taking from him. School lost its meaning. Music faded. The quiet, gifted boy who once moved chess pieces like a strategist slowly disappeared behind a harder shell. Every fight, every bad decision, every moment he tried to prove he wasn't weak pushed him further from the path he might have walked. And while outsiders would later say he chose the streets, they never saw the cracks forming long before he got there. The truth is simple. Christopher Young didn't wake up one day and decide to throw his life away. Trauma laid the track, the environment pushed the train forward, and by the time he recognized what it was costing him, the damage had already settled in. But his story didn't end there. What happened after he entered death row would flip everything he thought he knew about strength, identity, and the kind of change no one expected. When Christopher Young arrived on Texas death row, he braced himself for the violence he'd known all his life. He expected gang politics, constant tension, and the same street rules that had shaped him since childhood. But instead, he walked into a world defined by silence, a silence so heavy it pressed on his thoughts more than any enemy ever had. 23 hours a day in a solitary cell gave him something he'd never faced before: himself. No loud corners, no crew to impress, no chaos to hide behind. Just concrete walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the weight of everything he had spent years trying not to feel. At first, he fought it. He shouted, threw punches at the door, tried to hold on to the anger that once kept him alive. But death row doesn't bend for emotion. It waits. And eventually, that silence forced him to listen, not to others, but to the parts of himself he had ignored for years. Then came the encounter that completely changed him. His neighbor on the row, Reginald Blandin, didn't act like anyone Christopher had ever met in the streets. Reg carried himself with a calm that didn't come from weakness but from understanding. He didn't preach. He didn't judge. He simply lived in a way that made Christopher curious. One day, Christopher asked him for something to read, expecting a gritty street novel. Instead, Reg slid a small, worn book through the crack, As a Man Thinketh. It wasn't long, but the message hit deeper than any fist he'd ever thrown. The idea that his thoughts, not his environment, could shape his life shifted something inside him. That book became the beginning of a transformation he never saw coming. Reg gave him more to read, taught him how to control his anger, how to breathe before reacting, how to think like someone who deserved a future even if the state planned to take it. They passed notes under their doors, debated ideas, and built a brotherhood that helped Christopher grow in ways the free world never allowed. In 2009, when Reg was executed, the loss crushed him. It felt like losing a brother, a teacher, the one person who had held up a mirror and shown him who he could be. But instead of collapsing back into the life he once knew, Christopher made a promise: to keep growing, and to help others do the same. He became a mediator, stepping in to calm other inmates before fights erupted. He wrote letters to youth programs, created a curriculum meant to steer kids away from gang life, and became the kind of mentor he wished he had at 12. Even guards noticed the difference. The man who entered death row angry and defiant was now someone helping others survive it. The transformation was real, visible, undeniable. But on death row, growth doesn't change the date on the calendar. And Christopher's time was running out faster than he realized. By the time Christopher Young had spent a decade on death row, he wasn't recognizable as the man who entered it. The anger was gone, the defensiveness replaced with reflection, and the boy who once lived by street codes was now teaching others how to break free from them. His cell became less of a cage and more of a classroom, a place where younger inmates came for advice, where guards sought his help to calm escalating situations, and where he wrote letters hoping to stop kids from repeating his mistakes. But the most powerful shift came from something no one expected: forgiveness. Hasmukh Patel's own son, Sean Owen, reached out, not with bitterness but with a desire to understand. Over time, he saw the remorse, the accountability, and the genuine change in Christopher. Their conversations didn't erase the tragedy, but they built something rare: a bridge between two families torn apart by the same moment. Sean would eventually speak publicly, saying he didn't want the state to kill the man who had harmed his family. Yet even forgiveness from the victim's son couldn't move the system. As appeals continued, Christopher's lawyers pointed to something far more uncomfortable: the pattern of who receives mercy in Texas, and who doesn't. They highlighted cases where defendants with similar or worse crimes were spared, especially when those defendants were white. One case stood out clearly: a man who planned the deaths of his entire family had his sentence reduced to life just months earlier. Christopher's team argued that if redemption mattered, if behavior mattered, if fairness mattered, then his life should also be spared. But clemency in Texas is not decided by growth or transformation. It's decided by a board known for saying no. And each time Christopher's appeals were reviewed, the response was the same: a quiet rejection that said more about the system than about him. Despite everything he'd done to rebuild himself, despite the support from correctional officers, pastors, community leaders, and the victim's own son, his file kept landing in the same place. Another denial. Another reminder that changing your life doesn't mean the state will acknowledge you've changed. And as the rejections stacked up, the reality sharpened. Christopher Young had become a symbol of what the system refuses to reconsider: the idea that a person can evolve after their worst moment. His final hearing was approaching, and it would be his last chance to prove he deserved to live. But the moment he stepped into that room, he felt something in the air: a decision already made. When Christopher Young walked into the final parole hearing, he wasn't the shaken 21-year-old the state had chosen to remember. He was calm, deliberate, and steady, a man who had spent years rebuilding himself in a place designed to break people apart. He didn't walk in begging for sympathy. He walked in carrying truth. He spoke about the boy he once was: brilliant but wounded, talented but directionless, a child shaped more by trauma than opportunity. He spoke about the young man who stumbled into gang life searching for belonging, not violence. And then he spoke about the person he had become on death row: a mentor, a peacemaker, a father fighting to stay alive not for himself, but for the 3 daughters who still called him dad. But there was something heavier beneath his words: a challenge the board didn't seem prepared for. Christopher confronted the pattern he believed had defined his case: uneven justice. He pointed out the defendant whose crime shook the entire state, a man whose family was targeted and attacked, yet whose sentence was reduced to life. A white man granted mercy mere months before. Christopher asked the question no one wanted to say out loud: why was redemption recognized in one case but ignored in his? For a moment, the room held still. Not empathetic, just quiet. The kind of quiet that feels less like consideration and more like waiting for someone to stop talking. And when he finished, the board didn't ask a single question. No discussion about the years he spent guiding lost inmates. No acknowledgement of the forgiveness from the victim's son. No recognition of his growth, his remorse, his transformation. Just a brief pause, followed by the same cold finality he'd been hearing for years. Unanimous denial. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. They simply confirmed what Christopher felt the moment he walked in: the decision wasn't based on who he had become, but on who he used to be. As officers escorted him out of the room, the weight of that reality settled on his shoulders. His last appeal was gone. His final chance had collapsed in silence. All that remained now were the hours he had left, and the people he needed to say goodbye to before the clock reached 0. Back at the Polunsky unit, the air felt different. It wasn't fear, it was finality, the quiet realization that every hour still remaining in Christopher Young's life now had a purpose, and none of them could be wasted. He knew who he needed to see before the state carried out its decision. And when the visiting room door opened, they were already there, his 3 daughters, older now, standing with the quiet strength he once wished he had at their age. There was no barrier between them this time. No thick glass separating father from children. Just a table, too small for everything they wanted to say, and a moment that felt both endless and painfully short. Christopher held their hands and studied their faces, memorizing the details he wouldn't get another chance to see. He didn't speak in riddles or apologies. He spoke like a father finally able to teach the lessons he'd learned too late, about staying away from the streets, about choosing their own paths, about becoming the kind of women who wouldn't let the world define them. He told them that their worth wasn't tied to his mistakes, and their future didn't have to mirror the chaos he grew up in. The girls didn't break down. Their strength came in silence, in the way they squeezed his hands, in the way they leaned closer as if trying to hold onto the moment. They asked questions he tried to answer gently, avoiding the harshness of what tomorrow truly meant. And when the visit ended, none of them stood up right away. They lingered, holding on to the last few seconds before the guards signaled time. When they finally let go, Christopher watched them walk away, knowing that was the last time he'd ever feel their hands in his. The door closed behind them with a final click that echoed through him far louder than the sound itself. Back in his cell, the reality sharpened. The countdown had reached its final stretch. He ate the standard last meal slowly, wrote letters until his handwriting slipped, and prayed in the dim light that never truly went out. There was nothing left to appeal, nothing left to fight. Only the last steps of a journey that began years before anyone realized how complicated his story truly was. And as the night faded into morning, Christopher Young prepared himself for the short walk that would define how the world remembered him, even if it no longer reflected the man he had become. The morning of July 17, 2018, arrived without ceremony. No loud announcements, no sudden rush, just the quiet movement of officers who had done this too many times before. When they came for Christopher Young, he stood calmly, offering no resistance as they secured the chains around his wrists and ankles. Each step toward the transport van echoed in the hallway, a reminder that his journey was down to its final minutes. The ride to Huntsville was short, but the silence inside the vehicle felt endless. Christopher kept his eyes forward, steady, almost peaceful, not because he accepted what was happening, but because he refused to let fear define his last moments. He had changed too much to die as the man the system insisted he still was. Inside the death chamber, the light was bright and unforgiving. Witnesses filled the small viewing room, state officials, reporters, members of the Patel family, and spiritual supporters who had watched his transformation firsthand. Christopher was guided onto the gurney, the leather straps drawn across his legs, chest, and arms with clinical precision. He turned his head as far as the restraints allowed, searching the faces behind the glass. When he spoke, his voice didn't tremble. He apologized, not in a rehearsed, courtroom way, but with the weight of someone who had replayed his worst moment thousands of times. He spoke of change, of remorse, of hoping that something good might come from the end of his life, even if that hope was small. When the injection began, he whispered that it burned, the words slipping out on a breath that grew weaker with each second. Tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, sliding toward the edge of the gurney. His chest rose slower, then stopped altogether. At 6:39 p.m., the warden announced it was over. News outlets reported the execution quickly, noting the crime, the appeals, the final statements. But what they didn't capture was the quiet shift that rippled outward afterward, a mix of grief, debate, and uneasy reflection. For some, justice had been served. For others, a life that had finally found purpose was ended too soon. And for the people who knew Christopher Young on death row, the loss was personal, a reminder of how many men change only for the system to insist they never did. But the weight didn't fall on his name alone. 3 daughters lost their father. A community lost a mentor. And the story of Hasmukh Patel, the man whose life was taken, remained at the center, a reminder that tragedy didn't begin in the death chamber. It started years earlier, in a moment no one could undo. Christopher Young's final breath didn't erase the crime, and it didn't erase the pain. But it left the world with a question the system has never fully answered. What do we do with the people who change, when their past refuses to let them live long enough to prove it? Christopher Young's story doesn't fit neatly into ideas of guilt or innocence, redemption or punishment. It lives in the space between, where a man can be both responsible for a devastating tragedy and capable of becoming someone entirely different. His life shows how early pain can twist a child's future, how violence can echo through generations, and how a single moment can erase everything a person might have become. But it also reveals something harder to confront. Our system is built to judge the past, not the present. It saw the angry young man he once was, not the mentor he grew into. It measured the worst minute of his life against the best years that followed and chose to ignore the difference. Nothing can change what happened in that store. A family lost someone loved, and that grief deserves to be honored. But ending Christopher's life didn't undo the loss, it only extended the circle of it. One father taken, then another. One family shattered, then two. His journey forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What does justice look like when a person truly changes? Why do some receive mercy while others never get the chance? And how many lives are we willing to extinguish before we consider whether punishment alone can heal anything at all? Christopher Young didn't escape the trauma he was born into, but he transformed in spite of it. And in the end, his story leaves us with a truth too often ignored. Sometimes the people we sentence to die are the very ones who finally learned how to live.